Okay, so now we're going to talk about factoring. So what we're doing when we're factoring is we have a trinomial. So here we have this x squared plus 10x plus 21. And what we're really wanting to know is what two binomials did we multiply together to get this guy. Now, we are going to restrict all of our factoring to things that just have an x squared because that is by far the easiest thing to factor. When they start having numbers in front of your x squared, they get much more difficult in factoring. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to learn a different way to solve those types of problems. But for right now, we're just going to look at these things that are like this guy who factor relatively easily. So the first thing you want to do is we want to do our two parentheses because we know that that's what we want our final answer to look like. We also know, because my first term is x squared, that each term or each first term in my parentheses is going to be that number or that letter x, excuse me. Because if I do x times x, I get my first term, which is x squared. Now here's where the puzzle pieces start to come together. Okay, remember what we talked about before, where we said that the two numbers in our parentheses added to give you 10, and these two numbers in your parentheses multiply to give you 21. Now the one thing we are going to do is we're actually going to do the 21 first. The reason we're going to look at 21 first is because there are a lot less things that multiply to 21 than there are that add to 10. So it's always easy to start with the multiplication. So what we're going to do over here is we want two numbers. Okay, and we want them to do two things. The first thing we want them to do is multiply to 21. And then the second thing you want it to do is you want it to add to 10. So you're always multiplying to the last one, adding to the center. Now some of these are going to be easier than others, okay, and some of them won't have as many multiples, but if you're ever struggling with your multiples, and you might be, I know it, and you're shouting at me right now to put those numbers in, but I want you to know there's nothing wrong with having to write down the factors of that 21 if you're struggling trying to find that pair. And so what you can do is say, okay, so I have 21, oops, sorry about that, let me write that correctly. How about 21? And I could do 1 times 21. But when I add 1 and 21, that would give me 22. That is not what I want my center to be, because remember, I want my center to be 10. Okay, so the next multiple of 21 is 3 and 7. Well, if I add 3 and 7 together, that does indeed give me a 10. That is what I'm looking for. So I know that these two numbers are the numbers that are going to go in my parentheses. So I can come over here and say this is going to be x plus 3 and x plus 7. By the way, I put my 3 first. That does not mean you can't do x plus 7 and x plus 3. Doesn't matter where you put them in the parentheses, as long as you're putting a positive 3 and a positive 7. And it's really easy to check your work. All you have to do is go, is 3 plus 7 10? Yep, that's good. And is 3 times 7 21? Yep, we're good. So we know that this is going to factor out properly. So let's look at the next problem. So again, I'm going to start off putting my two parentheses because I know that that's what I want my final answer to be. Again, I have an x squared, so I know that I'm going to lead off on an x on both of these. Okay, so I'm going to come over here. I need two numbers. The first thing I want it to do is I want it to multiply to negative 40. Notice that when I wrote this down, I acknowledge that sign there too, because I don't want to just to multiply to 40. I actually want to acknowledge that I want it to be a negative 40. And then the second thing I need it to do is add to 3. Now let's talk about this particular combination of signs. First of all, because I want to multiply to a negative, I know that my signs need to be opposite. Oops, running out of room there. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. They need to be opposite of each other. That means I need to have one positive sign and one negative sign, because that is the only way I can multiply to a negative 40. Okay, then I'm going to look over here to this guy, because that means I have one positive and one negative sign. So who's going to be positive and who's going to be negative would be my next question. And the really cool thing is that center term will actually answer that for you, because you have a positive 3, you have a positive here, then your larger number is actually going to be positive, because it needs to be in order for you to have a positive and a negative added together and to come out as a positive. Your larger number has to be the positive. So kind of think of that. So those kind of things help you figure out what your patterns are going to be for these numbers. So let's go back to looking at our factors of negative 40. We know we're going to have a positive. We know we're going to have a negative. We also know that our larger number is going to be positive because we want to add to a positive 3. So we've got some good information there. So we can start with 1 and negative 40. But when we add those together, that's going to give us negative 39. That is way too big. So at this point, I think we probably need to jump a little bit, because negative 39 is such a large number when you're adding. So we need to get a little bit bigger from that 1. So the next thing I might look at would be 4. Okay, 4 will divide into 40 10 times. It's going to be a negative 10. Oops, nope, I'm sorry. It's going to be a positive 10 and a negative 4. Remember, my larger number needs to be positive. But that is going to add to give us a 6. Getting a little bit closer. Remember, I wanted 3. 6 isn't that far away, so we're pretty close here. So the next thing that multiplies into 40 would be 5 and 8. Again, remember, I want my larger number to be the positive, so it's going to be a positive 8 and a negative 5. When you add those together, that does indeed give you that 3 that you're wanting. So this is our pair that we're going to put in our parentheses. And it doesn't matter which parentheses you put them in, as long as you do a negative 5 and a positive 8. So over here, we've got negative 5, positive 8. All right, so let's look at the next one. Notice that one also has that negative on there. So we're going to do our 2 parentheses. Again, we're going to lead off with an X on both of those guys. So we want 2 numbers that one multiply to negative 12. And the second thing we want them to do is add to a negative 1. Remember, when you don't have a number sitting in front of a variable, it's always 1, and in this case it is a negative 1. So again, since this is negative, we know that our signs are opposite. So anytime that multiplication is a negative, we know we're going to have one negative and one positive. And then we're going to come down here and look at this guy. And we're going to say, okay, well, because this is negative, the larger number this time is actually going to be negative. Kind of a cool thing that addition is actually telling you who's going to be that positive and who's going to be that negative. So it's a neat little trick that we can do that there. Okay, so now we're looking at factors of negative 12. So like I could go 2 and 6. Remember, my larger number is my negative, so that's going to put that 6 as a negative. But when I add that together, that's going to give me negative 4. So that's not going to work. Oh, I could do 3 and 4. Again, my negative number is going to be the larger one, so that's going to be a negative 4. When I add that together, I get negative 1. Oh, look, there's my pair. So I'm going to use 3 and negative 4. Again, it doesn't matter which one I put in which parentheses, as long as my 4 is negative. So I've got plus 3 minus 4. Okay. We got one more example to go. And you'll notice that this one actually is very, very similar to the very first one we did. It's got the same numbers, but it's got some different signs going on here. So again, starting off the same way we have for each of these problems, we're going to do our 2 parentheses. We're going to lead off with our X. So over here we're going to find two numbers. One, it needs to multiply to 21, but this time I need it to add to a negative 10. Now I didn't talk about this on the very first problem, but what I want you to realize here is there are actually two ways to get a positive number when you multiply. You can either multiply two positive numbers together, or you could multiply two negative numbers together. So when you see a positive value right here, this tells you that the signs are going to be the same. Okay, so they're either both positive or they're both negative. Now, if I look at this guy, he's actually going to tell me that they are both negative, because the only way to get a negative number when I'm adding the same sign is to add two negatives together. Now, other than that, everything else is going to stay the same. I'm going to come over here with 21, and I can actually cheat a little bit because I already know the factors that add to 10. That's going to be 3 and 7, but this time they're both going to be negative. That is going to add to give me negative 10. That is what I want my parentheses to be, so that's my pair. And again, it doesn't matter which one I put in which parenthesis.